I'm proud to say that today's video is brought to you by Magellan TV. This is a new documentary streaming service which was created by actual filmmakers and their studios to showcase their passion for a variety of topics. Magellan TV has an incredible library of movies, documentaries, and exclusive playlists. This includes content on biographies, science, crime, and my favorite, history, which happens to come in a variety of eras from the ancient all the way to the modern. The content is brought to you without interruption or ads and is available in 4K without any additional cost. I was really happy to find their documentary series on modern tanks. The documentaries that they also have on the Second World War are also very, very impressive. I also like the idea that the videos can be watched anywhere and on any platform, including my phone. Now, if you click on the link below, you can not only help out my channel, but you can also get your first month free. So hit that link and begin your journey with Magellan TV today. And now for the video you've been waiting for. The 7th century bore witness to one of the greatest conquests in history. The armies of Islam had won an incredible string of victories, but the failed siege of Constantinople, which concluded in 678, marked a massive setback to an expansion that was otherwise nearly undaunted. The Umayyad Caliph, Muawiyah I, who had ordered the attack, was unable to bear the indignity of such a catastrophe. He was forced to settle on disadvantageous terms and died a broken man in 680. With his death, the caliphate would once again be rocked by a time of instability and civil war, known as the Second Fitna. This was triggered by a rising opposition to the Umayyad dynasty and exacerbated by their defeat at the walls of Theodosius. A rival faction would come to power, and the built-up hostility would spill over into open warfare that would last over 12 years. The Second Fitna would culminate in the year 692 with Umayyad armies laying siege to the very city of Mecca itself, where even the Kaaba was damaged. During this siege, the city was bombarded and the leader of the rival faction was killed. Thus, the Umayyad emerged as the victor and the Islamic expansion would begin once again. By the year 715, the Umayyad dynasty was nearing the apogee of its power. The lands under their control extended from the Punjab to the Pyrenees. Their armies were well trained and seasoned from seeing action on multiple fronts. Their navy was rebuilt and now had achieved a size that was unrivaled to anything it had before. For the Umayyad Caliph and his people, it was now time to settle an old score with their longest rival, the Empire of the Eastern Romans. The Caliph's timing could not have been better. The Byzantine were themselves in utter turmoil, a situation, mind you, that they had only themselves to blame. In 685, Emperor Justinian II came to power. Wanting to live up to the prestige of his name, he immediately increased the size of the army, rebuilt the navy, and adopted a hostile policy to regain lost lands. To further his cause, he ruled with an iron fist that grew throughout his reign ever more despotic. In 687, he signed a treaty with the Caliphate to secure his eastern border, and then launched a series of brutal campaigns to the west. The Slavs and the Bulgars, who had near-complete domination of the Balkans at this point, proved no match for imperial armies. Between 688 and 689, Justinian II conquered a great portion of their land. The Slavs in particular were ruthlessly forced to relocate to Asia Minor, where they would serve as the manpower for the emperor's growing war machine. With the war in the west concluded, Justinian II now turned his attention to the east. He knew that the Muslims were embroiled in the Second Fitna, and thus he broke his treaty with the Caliphate and sent in his armies. Initially, he was victorious in his campaign, but in 692 the emperor and his army met the caliph's men in Cilicia. At the ensuing Battle of Sebastopolis, Justinian's Slav reinforcements, the same ones that were forced to relocate, betrayed him and defected to his enemy, thus ensuring that the Byzantine army was decisively defeated. An enraged Justinian, now forced to retreat, turned his anger to brutally killing any Slav he could find. But while he was doing this, back in the capital, the emperor's oppressive reign, now complicated by his major defeat, made his opposition rise up against him. In 695, Justinian II was overthrown in a coup. He was then imprisoned, exiled, and to add insult to injury, his nose was cut off as he was ushered out of the city. The Byzantine Empire then descended into an incredibly uncertain time under, how do we say this nicely, ineffectual leadership. This was a period that was known as the 20 Years' Anarchy, where 6 emperors would come and go in rapid succession, 5 of which, by the way, that would depart rather violently. Now, despite everything that had happened to him, Justinian II was able to return to power. In 705, he had made an alliance with the Khan of the Bulgars, a man named Tervel. With his help, Justinian II returned to Constantinople, and under the cover of night, he entered the city in stealth. Once inside, he roused his supporters to rise up and retook the throne with a coup of his own. But his second reign was to prove even more disastrous than his first, something that John Julius Norwich would describe as a reign of terror. Justinian now unleashed his anger with a vengeance. He purged his officers, his nobility, and for that matter, anybody that dared to oppose him. In time, he turned on his allies, declared war on Tervel and the Bulgar people, and of course continued to persecute the Slavs. But on his eastern front, the Umayyad Caliphate, which had not forgotten his treachery, began to overrun Asia Minor. Every year, the Muslims would capture cities and fortresses and relentlessly push back the Byzantine border. Between these losses and his cruelty, his popularity plummeted, and thus in the year 711, his opposition rose up and the tyrannical rule of Justinian II finally came to an end. But this time he would lose not just his nose, but his life. The fortunes of the Eastern Roman Empire had indeed descended into a very dark time. The misfortunes of the Romans proved too good of an opportunity for the Umayyad to pass up. They already possessed most of the eastern portion of Anatolia, and their armies were relentlessly driving west. Now, according to Islamic prophecy, it was said that a man with the name of a prophet would take Constantinople. The caliph at the time was named Suleiman, thus fitting the bill. And not to let a prophecy go to waste, he mobilized the entire Umayyad war machine to lay to rest the successors of Rome. He would go on to say that, "I shall not cease from the struggle until I either conquer it, or I destroy the entire dominion of the Arabs in trying." Thus, in 715, preparations began with a massive expansion to the navy. The next year, in 716, the Umayyad Caliph deployed his general, Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik, to continue the advance over Asia Minor. Maslama was an excellent choice. He was an aristocrat who was related to the Caliph, and his loyalty was absolute. He was a consummate warrior whose defining quality was his code of honor. But what's more, he was an accomplished commander and a capable strategist. He had proven himself before against the Byzantine and the Khazar Khaganate, which lay to the north beyond the Caucasus Mountains. Warfare was in his DNA, and he was determined to succeed where his predecessors had failed. He moved slowly across Asia Minor, taking fortresses, cities, and ports, thus securing his line of supply and logistics. But Maslama wanted to take this a step further. He wanted to take advantage of the disunity of the Roman leadership. Central Anatolia at the time was governed by a man named Leo, who was a general in the Byzantine army. He had arisen through the ranks under Justinian II and was later appointed to the post of strategos, or governor. Leo happened to be both diplomatically shrewd and extremely intelligent. His ability to avoid the purges of the 20 Years' Anarchy gave testament to this. In the latter part of 716, Maslama marched on the city of Amorium, which for the record he intended to use as his winter headquarters before advancing on Constantinople the next year. A dialogue was started between the two men where Leo artfully convinced the Muslim general to support him in usurping the Roman throne, and in turn he stated he would become a vassal to the Caliphate. Maslama readily agreed, knowing that this would likely throw the Byzantine Empire back into civil war. And knowing that Leo was a military man, he decided to trust him at his word. Maslama would even go so far as to abandon his conquest of the city of Amorium to prove his dedication to this pact. And therefore, it was Leo that was able to take Amorium and use it as a base. And now, with his lands secured with this new treaty, the Byzantine general marched with his supporters on Constantinople. The emperor at the time was Theodosius III, who was perhaps one of the most reluctant in Byzantine history to come to power. He knew of Leo's military prowess and wisely abdicated to avoid further bloodshed. Leo, who would then be known to history as Leo III, became the new emperor. He entered the capital in triumph, and once he was satisfied that he was fully in charge of the city, he stockpiled all available resources, shut the gates, and then promptly broke all of his prior promises to the Muslims. Maslama's anger was easily justified, and confrontation was now inevitable. John Julius Norwich explains what happened next. Quote, "On March 25th in the year 717, the greatest emperor since Heraclius entered the city in triumph by the Golden Gate. He was just in time. In the high summer of 717, the caliph's brother, Maslama, marched across Asia Minor with a huge army of 80,000 men, and on August 15th, he stood before Constantinople. Just over a fortnight later, on September 1st, a general turned admiral named Suleiman entered the Sea of Marmara at the head of a fleet which the chroniclers estimated at 1,800 ships, and then the blockade of the city began." End quote. The situation for the Eastern Romans seemed rather bleak. They had just emerged from a period of major civil unrest, had lost much of their empire, and their new emperor had worn the crown for only 5 months. The Umayyad, on the other hand, had one of the largest and best armies in the world. It was well-trained, disciplined, and had experienced veterans. The Muslim navy was very extensive and effectively controlled most of the sea lanes. And at the head of their command, Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik was an effective and resourceful leader. He positioned his men along the land walls of Constantinople, but he knew that they were unbreachable. To protect his troops, the Umayyad commander even went so far as to follow in the footsteps of Julius Caesar. Much like the siege of Elysium, a double wall was constructed outside of Constantinople, with the Arab troops in their camp positioned in the middle, thus providing fortification from any possible attack. Roger Crowley goes on to explain just how dedicated the besiegers were. Quote, "The Arabs had advanced their strategy from the previous siege. It was quickly realized by the Muslim general Maslama that the walls of the city were invulnerable to siege machines. The seriousness of his intentions was underlined by the fact that the army brought wheat seed with them. In the autumn of 717, they plowed the ground and planted a food supply outside the walls for harvesting the following spring. They then settled down to wait. Everything had been carefully planned to crush the infidels." End quote. Their planning was indeed impressive, but the siege of Constantinople in 717 was to go down in history as the epitome of Murphy's Law. Soon after the Arab fleet arrived, the Byzantine deployed their navy. The great chain that blocked the entrance to the Golden Horn was lowered. Then the Greek fire ships, the dromons, sailed forth. Once again, the Roman ships were able to inflict damage, but this time it was not enough to drive off their adversary. The Muslims had learned from their prior mistakes. They would pull their ships back and would keep their naval bases a secret. The emperor would furthermore not risk his limited navy to go on the offensive. The dromons were therefore only moderately successful tactically, but strategically they allowed for the sea lanes of the Bosphorus to remain somewhat open, allowing for intermittent communication and resupply from ports in the Black Sea. Though this was not always reliable, the Muslim navy was still very formidable. Leo III, who had proven himself to be an expert of diplomacy, though some would probably call this treachery, would now outdo even himself. He reopened negotiations with Maslama. Now, the actual content of these negotiations is still debated. In one version, which seems to be the most consistent, Leo made the argument that if the Umayyad were to burn their own wheat, it would scare the Byzantine populace into thinking that the Muslims were about to engage in an all-out attack. Furthermore, he would go on to say that if Maslama were to, turn over some of his remaining grain supply, it might just be able to go a long way to convince the people of Constantinople of the benevolence of their attackers. And this, theoretically speaking, would make the inhabitants of the city more likely to capitulate. Well, that's at least how Leo masterfully sold it. Maslama, who wanted to adhere to the words of Sun Tzu, that is, to win without fighting is best, and who was still convinced that there was something redeeming in the words of Leo III, decided after long deliberation to take Leo's advice. He burnt the crops that his troops had just planted, and then sent some of his remaining grain into the city. Leo accepted the gift with open arms, and as soon as the sacks were unloaded, he sealed the gates, stopped all communication with the Umayyad commander, and then sat back and waited. The emperor knew that winter was coming, and Maslama, well, he knew nothing. Now, while all of this was going on, Leo III had been using his time and his diplomatic skills wisely. Before the Umayyad army had even arrived, he had initiated negotiations with Tervel, the Khan of the Bulgars, and had successfully persuaded him into an alliance. Tervel had mobilized his troops and eventually moved into position behind the Umayyad army. At first, they were limited to raiding the enemy. A direct attack at this time was rather impossible as the Muslim force outnumbered them and was well defended behind their double wall. However, the Bulgars, who had once been semi-nomads of the Caspian steppe, were best regarded for their fast cavalry, along with their skill with sword, spear, and bow. Instead of a direct attack, Tervel ordered his horsemen to intercept any Umayyad detachment and foraging party they could get their hands on. That is, anybody foolish enough to venture out from their fortifications. The Bulgars got really good at this. The chroniclers even speak of a force of 4,000 men being wiped out by a swift-moving Bulgarian attack. The Muslim besiegers now found themselves sandwiched between two enemy forces and running low on supplies. Their troubles were only to get worse. Crowley, in his book 1453, describes what happened next. Quote, Leo now sat tight behind his walls and refused to parley. The tricked army was then subjected to a winter of freak severity for which they were ill prepared. Snow laid on the ground for 100 days. The camels and horses started to perish in the cold. As they died, the increasingly desperate soldiers had no option but to eat them. The Greek chroniclers, not known for their objectivity, hinted at darker horrors. It is said, wrote Theophanes the Confessor, that they even cooked in ovens and ate dead men. The Arabs had no experience of the surprising severity of winters on the Bosphorus. The ground was even too hard to bury the dead. Hundreds, if not thousands of corpses had to be thrown into the sea." End quote. The emaciated and starving men of the Caliphate then faced the dread of a major outbreak. It was said by some accounts that plague descended on the camp, and in time even more were to experience an agonizing death before the Theodosian walls. The brutal winter eventually passed. Snows melted, and mountain passes opened up once again. In the spring of 718, the Caliph deployed a reinforcing army through Asia Minor. 2 Umayyad fleets were also dispatched with critically needed supplies and soldiers. The admirals of these 2 fleets were amply warned of Byzantine Romans and their Greek fire, but perhaps they should have been more wary of another contingency. Due to manpower shortages, many of these ships were crewed with Coptic Christians. These men had very little love and even less loyalty to the Caliphate, which had taxed them harshly for the war effort. Once the fleets had arrived, their crews defected to the Romans and revealed the location of their ships. Leo III pounced on this opportunity. He unleashed his navy to attack the Muslim ships, which were essentially immobilized without their crews. Their cargoes were quickly seized before all the vessels were set ablaze. Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik now no longer had a functioning navy. The material that was needed to repair the rest of his fleet, also damaged in the harsh cold, was now in Byzantine hands. With the Umayyad navy tactically out of commission, the lines of communication were opened up once again for the Eastern Romans. The emperor learned of the approaching army that the caliph had dispatched. But now Leo III had a free hand to ferry his troops across the Bosphorus and to bring together garrison units from across his empire. Once these forces were assembled, the Byzantine army marched against this incoming force. On the road from Nicaea to Nicomedia, an ambush was set, and the emperor once again showed his military prowess. When the trap was finally unleashed, the caliph's unsuspecting men were destroyed. For the besiegers of Constantinople, the situation got more desperate by the day. Reinforcements had been destroyed, the navy crippled, and much-needed supplies were now in the enemy's hands. Despite this, Maslama's dedication never wavered. But the caliph, who could see the grand strategic situation, knew it was time to extricate the Umayyad presence. On August 15th in the year 718, nearly a year to the day that the Umayyad army had arrived at the walls of Theodosius, the caliph gave the order to withdraw. The beleaguered soldiers of the caliphate gathered what they could and made their way to waiting ships. But as they did this, they had to abandon the double wall that they had once manned. Tervel and his Bulgar cavalry, who had been keeping a close eye on the Muslim position, had been waiting for this opportunity. The perimeter was now undefended, and the Muslim troops were exposed on their march to embark. The Khan gave the command to attack, and his forces swept down on their prey. The ensuing fight was nothing less than a slaughter, and later chroniclers would estimate the Umayyad dead at over 22,000, but the carnage had only begun. Roger Crowley, based on the writings of Theophanes the Confessor, gives the harrowing tale of just how bad things got. Quote, "The armies of the caliph lifted the siege and straggled home by land and sea. While the retreating soldiers were harassed across the Anatolian plateau, there was one further calamity in store for the Muslim cause. Many ships were destroyed by storms in the Sea of Marmara. The rest were overwhelmed by an underwater volcanic eruption in the Aegean that, as Theophanes the Confessor would say, brought the seawater to a boil, and as the pitch of their keels dissolved, their ships sank into the deep, crews and all." End quote. Of the 1,800 ships that were sent off to Constantinople, only 5 would return. Byzantium had taken the brunt of what the caliphate could bring to bear, and in the aftermath of this devastating siege, it still stood firm. This is by no means to say that the military capacity of the caliphate was broken. The Umayyad were still very powerful, and their raids would continue into the Eastern Roman heartland, as well as many other areas. But over the next 3 decades, the seemingly unrivaled Islamic expansion would suffer a string of major defeats on multiple fronts, of which the siege of the city on the Bosphorus would be one of many debacles. In 722, in what would one day be northern Spain, at the Battle of Covadonga, the kingdom of Asturias would prevail, which in turn would lay down the foundation for the reconquest or Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula. A few years later, on December 9th in the year 730, the Khazar Khaganate would crush a Muslim force at the Battle of Marj Ardabil. The Umayyad commander, a man named al-Jarrah ibn Abdullah, was killed and his head was taken as a trophy. Then, far to the west in 732, near the banks of the Loire, a mere 150 miles from Paris, the governor of Al-Andalus, a man named al-Ghafiqi, would suffer a massive defeat by Charles Martel, who had managed to take up an excellent defense position on the road to Tours. The Battle of Tours, as it would be known, would be regarded by historians as the turning point of the Islamic conquest. What's more, Charles Martel would go on to establish the powerful Carolingian dynasty, and his grandson, Charlemagne, would become the first Holy Roman Emperor. Now, even the great defender of Constantinople, Leo III, in his final years, would take to the field of battle once again. In the year 740, he led his troops against the Caliphate one last time. His old adversary had invaded Asia Minor with an enormous force. But the wily emperor, who was as sharp as he had ever been, managed to find an enemy detachment that had broken off from the main force. At what would be known as the Battle of Akroinon, he sent his men in and once again demolished his Umayyad opponent. The Umayyad dynasty was not to recover from these defeats so easily. There was a growing discontent with their rule. This was exacerbated by their failures on the battlefield and resulted in civil war. The third fitna would last for several years and culminated in 750 at the Battle of the River Zab. In the aftermath of this fight, the Umayyad were not just defeated, but their entire dynasty was overthrown. The Abbasid dynasty would come to power, but this new caliphate would never lay siege to Constantinople. The valiant defense of 717 to 718 almost seems to be overshadowed and somewhat forgotten by history. But in retrospect, it was here that the caliph concentrated the best quality and quantity of his forces. It was here that they crashed like a great wave up against the Theodosian walls, and it was here that they were defeated. But despite all of this, Islam would endure and the spirit of jihad would be ignited once again. Crowley expertly brings this home, quote, "Constantinople itself remained for Muslims both a scar and a source of deep longing. The sieges left a rich legacy of myth and folklore that was handed down the centuries. It included prophecies that foretold a cycle of defeat, death, and final victory. This was to be a long-range struggle. So huge was the architecture of conflict between Islam and Byzantium that no Muslim banners would be unfurled again before the city walls for another 650 years. But prophecy decreed that they would return." End quote.